listen to me. Well, Danté Stewart, thanks so much for joining us on Public Theologians. I'm excited to speak with you.
Yeah, likewise, Brother Casey. Thank you, bro.
Right on. So first, congratulations on your forthcoming book, Shoutin' in the Fire. That's coming out October 12th. I'm sure there's a way to pre-order even right now, so we'll drop a link in the show notes. That's by Convergent Publishing, so y'all check that out for sure. So first, tell us about the book.
Yeah. So Shoutin' in the Fire, it's part memoir, part collection of essays, really wrestling with the question. The central question for me was, what does it mean to be Black and Christian in America? Mm-hmm. And it's a story that journeys through my experiences from being a young little Black Pentecostal little dude, mm-hmm. Going to Clemson, playing ball at Clemson, and then going meet my wife and going beyond there, and then going through some very kind of critical, kind of traumatizing times through white evangelicalism and beyond. And it was really, at the end of the day, bro, it was really my offering to Black people. I wanted to write a book where we Black folk, can have our stories taken seriously. So I didn't want to write a book, that was just simply what people could easily characterize as a race book, as a book that's simply about, how do we deal with the race problem and things like that. Though mm-hmm. I do write about that, I wanted to do something like June Jordan. I wanted to break open a world inside of this book that, as June Jordan writes, I am Black alive mm-hmm. and looking back at you. And so that really is my book, is telling a story of me learning how to shout in the fire, me writing an epistle of love to us, of love and liberation, so that we can be seen, feel inspired and protected and loved and cherished, and walk in a world where we're free or whatnot, and in as many places and in as many ways as possible.
Yeah, right. And just to highlight on that too, I know you bring up a lot of these names and more throughout the course of the writing, but it really does remind me of, Toni Morrison's prose, of Ta-Nehisi Coates' essays, and we'll get into more of the explicitly theological voices he named, like James Cone later on, and a lot of obviously James Baldwin, which is. I was really, just really excited to encounter someone that's lived through that, and that's really a lived theology, mm-hmm. which is really what you do. So you as you mentioned, you get into a lot of questions of Black identity in mm-hmm. there. You write about a time at Clemson when you kind of started getting immersed into white culture, and specifically with the white church. And I'll quote you here. You say, I soon learned I was not like other Black people. I was the exception. They wanted me there, I believed. To be told that I was not like other Black people felt like praise. It felt like belonging. But I didn't know to care either. I was home. I had made it. I was the exception. So talk about the assimilation you're talking about and what it cost you as a young Black man.
Yeah, that's real. And if people, as people read, they'll realize, like, I was very particular in what I titled that chapter. It was entitled Wages, and that was a working metaphor for me, that there is always a cost and there's always a price to be paid. And that was really the working metaphor in that chapter, in that story, that, it did come with a cost to be in what I would call white social space. And I think we got to name it that way.
Sure.
We have to talk about the predominantly white institutions as white social space, because if we can't name those realities, then we can't understand our experiences in them. We can't reconstruct them to be more loving and just and equitable. And we can't really, in some sense, make our way through them, because so much of our life is performed and embodied oftentimes in white social space. Sure. Whether that be through sports, whether that be through religious school and church or whatnot, whether that be through social environments and communities and things like that. And so for me, the assimilation was almost invisible, but it was so powerful. It was invisible in the sense that it didn't allow itself to be named. It didn't allow itself, it was just church. Sure. It was just discipleship group. And the cost was that I started to believe that the places that I came from and the places that shaped me were less than. That they must be judged according to a standard that I embraced at Clemson University and within groups of FCA, et cetera. And we have to realize that no space is just neutral.
Sure.
There's already an inherited story, inherited values, inherited vision, inherited narratives, inherited judgments and ways we criticize and think about another. And so there were already inheritances that was caught up in that space. And what I inherited was the white social space way of seeing the world, in particular, the white religious space of seeing the world, which oftentimes is, and I would say is very integrally centered in a white supremacist way of seeing the world that believes that to be closer to white people is to be closer to God, and that to follow the white voice is to follow Jesus, and that to be, in some sense, rooted in the frameworks that white people have passed on and inherited is to be rooted in the frameworks that would allow us to be as free as possible, as loved as possible, and bring the most acclaim and acceptance for our lived experiences. And so the cost, speaking of the cost in that white social space, is enormous, but oftentimes, it's comfortable. And so as I write, I found home there, because for us coming from where we came from, it's like, make sure you find your church community and things like that, and playing football. Who is in most closest proximity to us as it relates to religion? White evangelicals and their parachurch organizations. And so usually those communities that have closest access to you are oftentimes who you believe you must be most accepted by. And so white evangelicals, they are in closest proximity to athletes. And that's kind of where we go and where we go and where we go. And inside of that social location, that social experience, that social reality is also bound up with values and principles and rhythms, which inform the way we name, see, and act within the world. So I'm thinking about, I'm thinking about my sociology background and thinking about C. Wright Mills and what he talks about the sociological imagination and the ways in which we name, see, and act within the world as individuals and societies, or as individuals and institutions, or the relationship between history and what's happening around us in biography and how we think about our own stories. And so as I thought about that, as I think about the cost is great, because oftentimes it does not teach us and cannot teach us how to embrace our Black humanity and love ourselves and walk in the freedom of that humanity. But oftentimes that humanity must be subservient to the demands and the logics and the litmus and, in some sense, the religion, as J. Cameron Carter so wonderfully speaks of, the religion of whiteness.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, you bring up a story and throughout the course of the narrative about a time that you were preaching in a large white church in Georgia. And I don't have it in front of me because I had to read this digitally, and I'm an old man becoming an older man. And so if I don't have the paper copy in front of me, it's I got to write it down. So I didn't write this one down, but I remember this story that you were telling about preaching in the midst of, and again, I forget who it was that was just murdered.
It was Alton. Both Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, because they were followed up. Yeah,
that was like right at the same time. Tell us about that experience, because it seems like that was a turning point for you in a lot of ways, and the callousness that you were met with in your social media posts, in your small group that you're leading, and so I wonder if you could describe that experience and the impact it had on you.
And that experience, man, it was just, I mean, so much was built up in that experience. Like so much was kind of crescendoing emotionally. Sure. And you feel the emotion in that experience, in that narrative, because I mean, you also see, like, you know, I'm not the hero of that story. Like, right. I am very much invested in white evangelicalism. I'm very much invested in what they imagine for us and for themselves. And so for me, during that moment, you know, I was not the hero. Like, I was very much invested, but then, like, I think what the Methodist theologian, I want to say Howard Snyder, talks about these catalytic moments, these paradigmatic moments that are like catalytic moments. That's almost like when they happen, they hit you, and like you can't forget them. And it offers an opportunity for paradigm shifting. And he was centered around a theology of renewal. So he was talking about, you know, personal renewal, social renewal, corporate renewal. Then he talked about conceptual renewal. And so when I think about these catalytic moments and leading the small groups, and Philando and Alton being murdered, and just the kind of visceral ways I write about those scenes, I didn't like, I in that moment, like, I wanted to be a reporter. So like I read as much as I could and watched as many videos as I could. And that was very, very hard to relive, and to listen and to hear the gunshots and to hear these things. And so as I went back in my own journal, because I keep a journal, I went back in my journals, you know, and kind of doing some archival kind of research on my own self. And I'm thinking about, like, you know, what I was writing about during that moment. And for me, the best way to describe those moments was I was so confused. I was so confused, and I was so vulnerable, but then I was so invested. And that's the complexity of that story. Yeah. That's the tension of it. I wasn't like a person like, oh, you know, we got to leave right now. Right. At that moment, I didn't leave. But I was seeing and hearing things, you know, that I could not get away from. And I think that so many of us, particularly us Black folk in white spaces, oftentimes those things happen and we don't have no language for those experiences. And so when I'm preaching, and I'm seeing this, and I'm just looking looking out at the sea of white faces. Like, it really hit me, bro. I ain't gonna lie, bro. It was like an existential experience. Like, like I was about to curse, but my bad.
No, you can curse. You would not be the first.
Okay. I was just like, damn, man, I don't belong here. Yeah. Like, this is not, like, I had found home, but like I had got to this point where, like, this ain't my home. This ain't the home for me and my wife. And it took me a while to kind of work through that. As you read about, you know, it took my wife, it took my friend Michaela, you know, it took some reading. It was a journey. Or whatnot. It just wasn't like, it wasn't no triumphant story. Like, you know, hey, I left, like, peace out. Like, no, it was just a part of it.
You didn't drop the mic and walk.
Yeah, that's just a part. And that's a part of the complexity of the story that needs to be told, is that we oftentimes, when we get so deeply caught up in spaces, it's oftentimes a lonely experience and a fearful experience that we oftentimes don't know how to make sense of it. And oftentimes we don't have the courage to leave. And so for me, I was feeling the vulnerability and the ugliness and just the but that journey was just beginning. And so for me, it represented for me a catalytic moment, as Howard Snyder would speak of conceptual renewal, of how I thought about the world. It was that moment where I was like, yeah, I need to read some James. Well, actually, Drew handed me Martin Luther King's book, and I read James Baldwin. And as I started to read Black literature, you know, those moments was really the first time I'd had ever completed and read a book by somebody Black who looked like me. And so it represented a catalytic event and a conceptual moment that changed, as we're talking now, the trajectory of my life.
I want to I want to press into that too a little bit, which, I mean, as someone that wrote a memoir and these really personal essays, I don't know how it feels to you to kind of open those veins over and over again.
Yeah, it's cool, bro. That's I mean, it's out there now. It's better to be out there, so I'm gonna have to talk about it. So it's out there now.
Like, this is the content of the book, but golly, so I got a human staring back at me. So I want to press it, but yeah, you talk a lot about your formation and those catalytic moments being formed by your wife. And I was reminded of my own sort of journey and kind of being dragged along by my wife that has always been ahead of me on everything. So yeah, maybe this is a happier topic to kind of draw more blood from you. But yeah, talk about Jasmine and how your wife is
dog. Thank you for asking me this question. Like this book, as you got to the acknowledgments, like this book would not be what it is without my wife. Mm-hmm. Like I would not be who I am without my wife. Like I'm sitting right here right now, and I have these things, right? So these are 2 letters. My wife is in the Air Force. 2 letters from basic training that this past week, I opened up that she wrote to me. And I'm just like, I'm going back in time, bruh. And I'm just like looking at right now, and I'm just so giddy. I'm so happy. I'm so loved, dog. Like there's nothing like having somebody so deeply invested and deeply in love with you that they would still, like, they would support you in the midst of transitions.
Yeah.
And I gotta be honest, bro. My wife didn't deserve those things I put her through. And that's the reality that we got to talk about in so many of these spaces. I took my wife through things she never deserved just simply because, and these spaces compensated for the trauma that I was going through.
Yeah.
And sadly, there's a lot of regret. It just is what it is.
Yeah.
I regret so many things. And I learn from so many things, as people, I invite people into the space between our marriage, bro. Like, and I wanted to tell that story, like, yo, like, I ain't the hero, bro.
Yeah.
I am not the hero. Like, there are going to be moments in my book where you're like so proud of me, but there are going to be moments in my book where you're like, dude, like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Like that is not okay. Like, that's not okay. Especially that moment where, like, I write about, like, well, like, I love white people more than I love my Black wife. And that's just real. Yeah. That's what it was at that moment. Like, these people and their acceptance and what they could bring me mattered more. And, to think about that and to do what I needed to do to grow from that and to mature from that and to become a better person through that, I got to give all praise to my wife, because more than any other book, more than any other relationship, more than any other friendship, more than any other whatever, it was my wife who shaped who I was and who was a barometer for who I was becoming. And so, so much of my story, so much of this story is a reflection of the woman, of the person, of the Christian, of the wife, of the brilliant visionary, of the counselor, of the everything that my wife is to me. And I knew I wanted people to see, like, just how beautiful and how bold and courageous my wife is, and how just so much of who I am, dog, I just would not be the person I am without her, bro. And so, like, I could talk about my wife all day and about this story and just the way
It's great.
like, but then in the writing process, like I read stuff to her and she was like, I don't like that. I don't like that. That sounds good.
Bold thing to read stuff to your wife that you wrote.
Yeah. Bro, everything, bro. My wife get tired of me reading. I read everything to Jazz, like everything. Like she is the first person who hears everything.
Yeah.
And so much of what I put out in the world, it's like she read it. And sometimes she like it, sometimes she don't. And then sometimes she be like, "Yeah, that's real. Like that's real good."
Yeah.
And that's that's when I feel really good about it. And I think it's nothing better than to have somebody like Jazz to celebrate so much of this with. So much of the story, there are moments that are hard in this book. But this book is not a trauma story.
Yeah.
This book is a story of how beautiful we learn how to be together and be human and survive and make something of life, given the worst of circumstances. And I'm just glad that I'm able to do that with her and do that together.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. So to shift a little bit more into that, and maybe this would be a good transition because I've mentioned before that my wife is a therapist. And so one of the things that she talks about, particularly with trauma, as you said, that's not a book just on trauma, and we'll get to the hope that is really throughout this book. But one thing that she talks about, my wife talks about a lot, is also the coping mechanisms that are useful to us in times of trauma, and how they almost serve as a friend to us. And later we have to wrestle with what that meant to be able to get by. And you do talk about trauma. You talk about the time with your siblings, and I think you had a cousin or two there that y'all were shot at on the side of the road. And you talk, again, you talk about Alton Sterling, you talk about Stephon Clark, you talk about Mike Brown, Trayvon Martin, Ahmaud Arbery. You talk about you write about, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what I was reading into it. You write about seeing those dead Black bodies in the same way that you write about your uncle, the same way you write about being a witness to death. Talk about how that violence and how that trauma has formed you. And I promise we'll hopefully get away from the trauma.
No, you're good, bro. Because you're good. And I think about Elizabeth Alexander's brilliant essay. If people haven't read that joint in the New Yorker, her essay is entitled "The Trayvon Generation," and I end up citing her essay in the book, where she writes this essay about how she worries about people in our generation, in my generation, where she calls us the Trayvon generation. I want to quote her real quick. She says that they always, talking of us, they always knew of these stories. These stories formed their worldview. These stories help instruct young African Americans about their embodiment and their vulnerability. These stories were primers in fear and futility. These stories were the ground soil of their rage. These stories instructed them that anti-Black hatred and violence were never far. And in some sense, that shaped this essay in a very real way, shaped how I thought about embodiment and vulnerability. Like if there are two themes that characterize my book, if we think about doing close reading of the text and literary themes of the book, embodiment and vulnerability are at the heart of my book. That one paragraph characterized my book. Literally, it was the soil of my rage. Literally, it was primers for fear and futility. Literally, it instructed me about the way I be Black in the world and the vulnerability that I'm forced into, but also the vulnerability that I must embrace as it relates to trying to imagine better. Because to imagine better is a vulnerable process. Like to learn to travel and traverse these places that I went through, you got to be okay with learning something different. And as people go through my story, they see there was like, it is a profoundly courageous story to learn. And I think at the heart of these ideas of trauma and violence is that it's like what Imani Perry says: racism is terrible, Blackness is not. That's the thing. That is what it instructed me in. Racism and white supremacy is terrible.
That's the problem. Yeah.
That's the problem.
Blackness. Yeah.
Blackness is not. And I think this is what so many people miss, especially when they talk about anti-racism. You know, I think about Tarana Burke, who just released an incredible, beautiful book, Unbound. And she released that joint. She did that joint with Brene Brown. Her and Brene did that incredible book, You Are Your Best Thing. And they were doing this interview together, and this interview was just such a beautiful interview. And one of the things Tarana said, she was talking about 2020. She said, you know, anti-racism was the talk of the day, but nobody was talking about Black humanity and what it does to us and what we have to offer. And I think when I think about trauma and violence, I want to think about Blackness is not terrible. But for me, Blackness is sacred, holy. It is salvation. For me, it is the way, it is the critical. I'm gonna get very academic real quick.
Do it.
You know, in light of Katie Cannon, I love theologian Katie Cannon. And I think about her and thinking about Blackness, it is the critical epistemic starting point. And the biotextual specificity of my own story that allows me to imagine and embrace divine possibilities. It is the place that I starred in the world as the woman to speak of. It is the place that Toni Morrison talks about, where I learned how to flesh. That yonder, thinking about trauma and violence, yonder in the white world, but also as I write about in the Black world, yonder beyond ourselves, even within the context of Black people. Sometimes they don't love your flesh. But here in this place, we got a flesh that weeps, flesh that dances in the grass. For this love of your flesh is the prize. And I think as Toni Morrison, you know, just doing incredible theology in Beloved and just all of her work, I think she is inviting us to the heart of the Christian story, the heart of this story of God holding out the possibility, wrapped up in the story and person of Jesus, holding out divine possibilities for us to imagine better for ourselves, i.e., the kingdom of God. And so when I think about trauma and violence, I want to talk about them in the most visceral, honest, complex, and nuanced ways possible, but I don't want to make them the totality of my story. I want to lean into what Imani says. Blackness is beautiful. It's not terrible. Racism is terrible. Blackness is not.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've been very, yeah.
Can you edit this?
Yeah.
Cool. Let me get my charger real quick.
Yeah.
Computer.
I'll get my coffee. There we go. So I wanted to stay on that theme one more time, and get into the beauty of Blackness as you speak of. So there's a real problem when we discuss this, and you just mentioned Tamara Burke's piece on that, and the point of this is, we talk about anti-racism, we talk about violence, but we very rarely in larger discourse talk about just Black humanity and the beauty of Blackness. So there's a problem that Noam Chomsky talked about years ago of worthy and unworthy victims. Worthy and unworthy victims in our popular discourse. And, the questions come, especially for folks that look like me, wasn't Mike Brown robbing a convenience store? Wasn't Eric Gardner selling illegal smokes? Wasn't George Floyd on some sort of drugs and passing a counterfeit $20 bill? You write about George Floyd. He said, I saw in him neither a saint nor a criminal. I saw in him neither celebrity nor failure. I saw in him neither struggle nor redemption. I saw George. My eyes were beholding a human, a beloved and beautiful Black body.
Okay, I forgot I wrote that. That was actually kind of good. That was kind of good. I ain't gonna flip. That was real. No, for real though. Like legit. Like so many people was talking about him, and even like Breonna Taylor. Like so many people were talking about them as if like you have to be perfect to stay alive.
Right.
Like, and I wanted to, in my narrative, push back against that notion. Like, I want to say Black people don't have to be perfect to stay alive, to be seen, cherished, and loved. Like, we're human and we're worthy of full citizenship rights, like full protection under the law and society. We're worthy of full freedom, no matter where we are. We are worthy to exist. But as Elizabeth Alexander wrote up, anti-Black hatred and violence were never far. And anti-Blackness, I think when you talk about living in an anti-Black world, it's not simply, the kind of open bigotry, but it's an experience that devalues your personhood or exceptionalizes you or disrespects you or treats you as if like you're second class. Like, it's very anti-Black to say that we have to be perfect to stay alive because other people, I mean, the bar is so low in this country. Yeah. We know what happens with other demographics or whatnot. And so, why do we have to be perfect? When other people are imperfect and get rewarded, and things like that. And so I was trying to narratively and conceptually work against that ideology. And I wanted people to see, that's who, like George Floyd, that's who he is. He's a human being. He's a beautiful human being. Sandra Bland is a beautiful human being. Breonna Taylor is a beautiful human being. These others, Ahmaud Arbery, all these names are beautiful human beings. And if we can't see Black people as beautiful and worthy of existence, then we will always create conditions in which we die for the littlest of circumstances. I remember it was somebody who said, I can't remember who said it, but I remember Jonathan Walton, a dean of the Divinity School at Wake Forest, who wrote a really good book, Lens of Love. I think he was quoting somebody else where he says, if people can get you to believe absurdities, then they can get you to commit atrocities. And I think the absurdity of our lives having to be perfect really is at the crux of the atrocity of us having to be forced to deal with a world that hates us. And so when I write about George, when I write about others, when I write about my mama, my grandma, and my daddy, and us, I want to write in that way that our Black stories are worth telling and holding on to and cherishing. And when people read Shouting in the Fire, when they read that, it ain't a book that's to teach white folk. Yeah. White folk can be taught, and white folk are part of that conversation, part of that narrative. But I don't want people to easily walk away and say, this is just simply a book that's to help us think about racism. Yeah. No, this is a book that I hope once people walk away, we will, even myself, be able to better embrace and celebrate and explore our embodied Black humanity.
Yeah. And I think it definitely does that. And I think what you're describing, I would maybe conceptualize as like the difference between, call it allyship, or sort of pity, and
Yeah.
solidarity, and recognizing a shared humanity, and a distinct humanity, and a distinct story that's worthy of not just pity, and not just standing up so that folks that look like you can stay alive, but also, but more so, yeah, joining in our stories, joining in your story and hearing, which I think I'm so grateful for you sharing, and again pushing all the way into your story, and you letting your blood run on these pages, and in this conversation. I wanted to, since this is a podcast on theology, and since you're really a strong theologian, I wanted to share kind of a personal story and get some of your thoughts too. So I graduated in 2010 after like 8 years of theological higher education. Like a lot of people, my bookshelf was full of old dead white guys, and after I graduated, I pretty much stopped reading theology for next to a decade.
I can understand why. I can understand that. Yeah.
And it wasn't until 2018, when James Cone passed, that I picked up a book on theology after all that time, and I picked up God of the Oppressed. And I'm not exaggerating when I say it changed my life. My politics had shifted to a point that I could not make sense of the theology that I was so invested in. And encountering James Cone, for me, not only just gave a rationalization to my politic, but gave a foundation and breathed life into how I came into and how I showed up in the world. So it seems like you obviously have a distinct experience from me in that, but it seems like once you picked up those Black theologians, once you picked up James Baldwin, once you picked up James Cone, and really invested in their work, it seems like that was also that even the larger changes that you're talking about in you. So maybe talk about the impact those Black theologians had on you and your development.
Yeah, for sure. So like when I think about, Black theology, it was really, Cone and Baldwin and Morrison and others who were really a catalyst, particularly when I think about like the type of theological questions and constructs and ideas and frameworks that we imagine for ourselves. So my biblical interpretation changed. I started to take seriously the ability to think about divine realities through Black literature. So I started to read Black literature as sacred text, as text that's generating metaphors and meaning to think about, the ultimate questions, or Paul Tillich would write, the ultimate concern. And for me, the ultimate concern was, in some sense, how do I live and love in a world that's built against us, but also live and love in ways that I embrace our humanity and embrace our liberation, particularly doing that as situated in the world as a Christian. And so like Baldwin and Morrison and Bambara and Giovanni and the likes, really became critical ways of me asking theological questions. And so yeah, they like Baldwin and Cone, man, they really gave me frameworks to understand my experience, but also, when you talk about bitterness and experience, oftentimes bitterness happens when we don't have any alternatives. And so we have to relive our trauma. And so they gave me alternatives to help me emotionally, conceptually, theologically, work through where I came from, and offer possibilities, and made intelligible divine possibilities rooted in the ways Black people name and build the world. And so for me, I just took that type of Black world building as a place, as Terry Young Williamson writes about, as much a starting place of thinking about my own life and my own story and even my own theology as any other starting place. And so, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I wish we could have more time to talk, and hopefully I'll wrangle you back in at some other point.
Yeah,
I'm
for
sure
sure.
you got a lot of conversations
Got you.
coming up about this
Got you.
book. Again, I'm gonna post a link to Shoutin in the Fire, and
Perfect.
folks pre-order that. And otherwise, how do we follow your work? Tell us.
Yeah. Just follow me on my handles are at Stewart Danté C, or you can visit me at my website, dantestewart.com. Whatnot. I try and get back to everybody, you know, as I possibly can, given time constraints and things like that. So yeah, hit me up and I'll definitely be in touch.
Yeah. Well, right on. It's been a pleasure. I was excited to speak with you, and even more excited to go back and revisit this conversation, even in editing. So yeah, thanks again. Really appreciate it.
No doubt, brother. This has been great. Thank you for your questions, your intentionality and reading and the things you cited. Thank you for the care that you have for my work. So yeah, I appreciate you.
Yeah, but well, likewise, and enjoy your conversations with professors. It's it's a world that I'm not jealous of. Right?
It's my thesis writing time. So we heavy in research. My thesis is on Baldwin, so we heavy in research right now. So
okay.
Yeah. Yep.
Good subject then. All right, brother.
No
I'll let you go.
All right,
and appreciate you.
All right, take care.
I do.
All right.